My last thought, I would just forget his cruel words and leave. But that moment at the airport was the day he lost everything he held dear. Before I start the story, I want to get to know you too. Write the flag colors of the country you're watching from, and I'll try to guess. Who knows? Maybe we're neighbors. I never imagined that at 72 years old, I would experience the worst humiliation of my life in front of an airport packed with people, listening to my own son's screaming voice as he put me on display in front of everyone, like I was a child without sense, a useless burden who only served to annoy, and who no longer had any value to him. I was at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport waiting for my flight to visit my sister when the worst moment of my life happened. I had just called Marcus, my only son, to let him know I would arrive a little later because the flight was delayed. It was a simple trip, just 3 days to help my sister Lorraine, who had broken her arm. But when I explained this to Marcus, he exploded in front of me in a way I never imagined possible. "Mom, enough with that story. You always look for excuses not to watch the kids when Tanya needs to work." I tried to explain that I had planned this trip 2 weeks ago, but he didn't want to listen. What happened next left my heart shattered forever. Right there, in the middle of the airport, full of people, passengers walking by with their luggage, families saying goodbye, Marcus screamed at me in a way that echoed throughout the entire terminal. "Stop being useless. You can't even take care of your own grandchildren properly." I felt like every person stopped to stare at us. An elderly lady nearby took my arm gently, as if she wanted to protect me. A young couple looked away with embarrassment. Even the airport employees stood silent, watching the scene unfold. I stood there trembling, tears in my eyes, unable to believe those words had come from the mouth of the son I raised alone after his father passed away. It was like a stranger was yelling at me, the little boy I used to hold in my arms when he had nightmares. Marcus didn't even wait for my response. He stormed off, leaving me there humiliated in front of dozens of strangers who had witnessed everything. An airline employee approached carefully and asked if I was okay. I wiped my tears, took my carry-on bag, and walked toward the boarding gate. My flight was being announced, but I could barely hear the announcements. My head was spinning. My chest hurt like someone had hit me. As I showed my ticket to the gate agent, a voice inside my head whispered something that would change everything. "If he thinks you're useless, maybe it's time he discovered how much you're really worth." But what Marcus didn't know was that during those minutes of humiliation at the airport, I had made a decision that would change his life forever. On the plane, I couldn't stop trembling. The flight attendant asked if I needed anything, but I just shook my head. How could I explain that my own son had called me useless in front of hundreds of people? How could I tell her that after 72 years of life, after raising that boy completely alone, he saw me as a burden? I settled into my window seat and watched the clouds pass as the plane rose above the city. In that moment, something inside me broke definitively. It wasn't just the pain of cruel words, but the terrible understanding that for my son, I had become a nuisance, someone who existed solely to solve his problems when he needed it. I remembered all the times in recent years that Marcus had used exactly the same words. "Mom, watch the kids. Mom, pick up the kids from school. Mom, cook for Sunday dinner." Never a please, never, "Can you help me?" It was like my only function in life was to be available whenever he needed me. And when, for the first time in years, I needed to do something for my family, help my sister Lorraine with her broken arm, I became a selfish and useless person. Tears began rolling down my cheeks as the plane moved through the clouds. An elderly lady sitting next to me offered me a tissue and smiled with understanding, as if she too had gone through something similar. "Family troubles, honey?" she asked with a soft voice. I nodded, unable to speak. "Oh, sweetie, I went through that too. Sometimes children forget everything we did for them," she said, taking my hand with affection. I didn't know why, but those words from a stranger comforted me more than Marcus's apologies could ever do. Because she was right. He had completely forgotten everything I had done for him throughout his entire life. He had forgotten the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, the extra jobs I took to pay for his education, all the times I put his needs before my own. For him, I was simply the grandmother who babysits and nothing more. The flight to Memphis lasted just over an hour, but those 60 minutes were enough for my life to change completely. While I looked through the window at the mountains and valleys stretching below, I began thinking about things I hadn't thought about in years. When was the last time someone asked me what I wanted to do with my free time? When was the last time someone thanked me for something I did? When was the last time I felt valued as a person and not just as a free domestic employee? I couldn't remember a single recent occasion, and that hurt more than all of Marcus's cruel words combined. When the plane landed in Memphis, something had fundamentally changed inside me. It wasn't just anger or sadness. It was a cold, determined clarity I had never felt before. As I got off the plane and walked through the airport toward where my sister, Lorraine, was waiting for me, I knew these 3 days in Memphis wouldn't just be to help her with her broken arm. They were going to be 3 days to plan the rest of my life. A life where I would matter as much as anyone else. A life where no one would ever call me useless again. Never again. Lorraine was waiting for me in the arrivals area with her arm in a sling and a worried smile on her face. When she saw me, she immediately knew something terrible had happened. "Evelyn, what's wrong with you? You look so pale," she said while hugging me with her good arm. I couldn't hold back anymore. Right there in the airport, I told her everything that had happened. Marcus's screaming, people's stares, the humiliation, everything. Lorraine listened in silence, but I saw how her eyes filled with tears of rage. "That boy has lost his mind. How dare he talk to you like that after everything you did for him?" she said as we walked toward the taxi. "Evelyn, you raised that child completely alone after Samuel died. You worked day and night to give him everything he needed. You paid for his college, helped him buy his house. You've taken care of his children like they were your own, and now he treats you like you're his servant." Her words confirmed what I already knew in my heart. Marcus had become a completely different person from the sweet, grateful boy I had raised. During the taxi ride from the airport to Lorraine's house in South Memphis, I couldn't stop thinking about the last 5 years since Marcus married Tanya. At first, Tanya had been very kind to me. She called me Mama Evelyn and always included me in family plans. But little by little, especially after the twins Malik and Miles were born 3 years ago, I began to feel that my role in the family had changed. I was no longer the beloved grandmother who came to visit. I had become the free babysitter who was always available. Weekends were no longer for family time together, but for me to watch the kids while Marcus and Tanya went out with their friends. Holidays were no longer family celebrations, but opportunities for me to cook for everyone while they had fun. And when I finally needed something, like this visit to Lorraine, I became a problematic person who didn't understand the family's true priorities. As the taxi navigated through Memphis streets, I understood it hadn't been a gradual change. Marcus had been planning for some time to turn me into his personal employee, and I had been too blind to see it. "We're here, ladies," said the taxi driver, interrupting my bitter thoughts. Lorraine's house was small but cozy, with a garden full of flowers she tended with such love. While I paid the taxi driver, I thought about how different Lorraine's life was compared to mine. She was also a widow, but she had learned to live for herself after her children left home. She had her plants, her friends from the senior group, her favorite TV shows. She had her own life. I, on the other hand, had let my life revolve completely around Marcus and his family, and now I realized how foolish I had been. That first night at Lorraine's house, after helping her with dinner and making sure she was comfortable, I sat in the small backyard under the stars. The fresh Memphis air calmed me a little, but I couldn't stop turning over everything that had happened. I stayed there for hours, remembering every detail of the humiliation at the airport, every cruel word from Marcus, every pitying look from the strangers who had witnessed everything. And the more I thought about it, the clearer something became that I had been denying for years. My son no longer loved me like before. For him, I was a convenient resource, not a person with feelings and dignity. But in the middle of all that sadness and pain, something else began to grow inside me. It was a cold, silent determination I had never felt before. If Marcus believed I was useless, then it was time to show him exactly what value a useless person had in his life. It was time for them to learn to value what they had before losing it forever. And as the stars shone over Lorraine's garden, I began planning the changes that would alter everything. Because at 72 years old, I had finally learned a lesson I should have learned much earlier. No one can humiliate you without your permission, and I was no longer going to give that permission ever again. The night breeze caressed my face as I made the most important decision of my entire life. Marcus wanted me to disappear from his path, and that was exactly what I was going to do, but not in the way he expected. The 3 days in Memphis passed like a blur of painful memories and deep reflections. During the day, I helped my sister Lorraine with basic tasks. Preparing food with one hand is almost impossible. Bathing with a cast is quite an adventure. And even opening a jar of jam becomes an epic struggle. But at night, when Lorraine fell asleep, I stayed awake in the small guest room, going over every moment of my life with Marcus, trying to understand when exactly my loving son had become this cruel man who screamed useless at me in front of strangers. I vividly remembered when Marcus was little and his father Samuel died in that horrible car accident on I-40. Marcus was barely 12 years old, and I remember how he clung to me that terrible night at the hospital. It was time for them to learn to value what they had before losing it forever. And as the stars shone over Lorraine's garden, I began planning the changes that would alter everything. Because at 72 years old, I had finally learned a lesson I should have learned much earlier. No one can humiliate you without your permission, and I was no longer going to give that permission ever again. The night breeze caressed my face as I made the most important decision of my entire life. Marcus wanted me to disappear from his path, and that was exactly what I was going to do, but not in the way he expected. The 3 days in Memphis passed like a blur of painful memories and deep reflections. During the day, I helped my sister Lorraine with basic tasks. Preparing food with one hand is almost impossible. Bathing with a cast is quite an adventure. and even opening a jar of jam becomes an epic struggle. But at night, when Lorraine fell asleep, I stayed awake in the small guest room, going over every moment of my life with Marcus, trying to understand when exactly my loving son had become this cruel man who screamed useless at me in front of strangers. I vividly remembered when Marcus was little and his father, Samuel, died in that horrible car accident on I-40. Marcus was barely 12 years old, and I remember how he clung to me that terrible night at the hospital, crying and telling me, "Mama, don't leave me alone. Please, don't leave me alone." I held him tight and promised him I would never abandon him, that we would always be together, that I would be his mama and his daddy at the same time. And I kept that promise for the next 20 years. I worked as a secretary at a government office during the day and cleaned offices at night to be able to pay for the private school he wanted, the soccer classes he loved so much, the expensive books he needed for his studies. When Marcus turned 15 and all his friends had huge parties with live music and everything, I sold my gold earrings that Samuel had given me on our anniversary to be able to give him the celebration he dreamed of. When he wanted to study business administration at Emory University, one of the most expensive in the state, I took out loans, worked extra weekends, and even sold my wedding ring to be able to pay the tuition. I never told him I had sold the ring. When he asked where it was, I told him I had taken it to be repaired. He never asked again, and I was never able to replace it. Tears rolled down my face as I remembered all those sacrifices I had made with so much love. When Marcus graduated from college, he hugged me tight at the ceremony and told me, "Mama, everything I am, I owe to you. I'm never going to forget everything you did for me." Those words filled my heart with happiness. I thought all the sacrifices, all the sleepless nights working, all the meals I skipped so he could eat better, everything had been worth it. My son loved and valued me, or so I believed at that moment, before realizing that young people's promises are like smoke. They look beautiful when you make them, but they vanish with the first wind that blows. During his last year of college, Marcus met Tanya at a faculty party. She was studying graphic design and came from an upper-middle-class family from Buckhead. From the beginning, I noticed that Tanya treated me differently than how Marcus had described she treated other people. She was polite but cold. She smiled, but it never reached her eyes. When Marcus told me he wanted to marry her after graduation, I tried to talk to him about my concerns, but he said I was being overprotective and that I had to learn to let go. The wedding was beautiful, in a lovely church in Old Fourth Ward. I paid my share of the expenses, working double shifts for 6 months, but I never complained because I wanted Marcus to be happy. During the ceremony, when the minister asked if anyone had any objections, a little voice in my head whispered that I should say something, but I silenced it immediately. How could I ruin my son's happiest day because of a strange feeling about his bride? I convinced myself it was just a mother's nerves and that with time, Tanya and I would get along better. How wrong I was. The first 2 years of marriage were relatively calm. Marcus and Tanya rented a small apartment in College Park, and I visited them on Sundays for lunch. Tanya cooked, though not very well, honestly, and Marcus told me about his work at a marketing company. They were pleasant moments, although I always felt a subtle tension in the air, as if Tanya was tolerating my presence more than enjoying it. But Marcus seemed happy, and that was what mattered to me. Until the economic problems came. The company where Marcus worked began reducing staff, and although he didn't lose his job, they significantly cut his salary. At the same time, Tanya became pregnant with the twins, and medical expenses began piling up. One night, Marcus called me crying. "Mama, I don't know what we're going to do. We can't afford the rent, the doctors, the food. Tanya's very stressed with the pregnancy, and I feel like a failure." Without hesitating for a second, I told him I would sell my small property in East Point that I had inherited from my parents and give them the money so they could buy their own house. "But Mama, that property is all you have left from your parents," Marcus said. "It doesn't matter, son. What's important is that you have a safe home to raise my grandchildren," I responded. That's how I sold the last thing I had left from my original family to secure the future of the family I had created. With that money, Marcus and Tanya bought a small but nice house in East Point with 3 bedrooms, one for them, one for the babies who were coming, and one for me, for when I wanted to visit them. That last phrase should have alerted me, but I was too excited thinking about my future grandchildren to pay attention to the warning signs. When Malik and Miles were born, I felt a happiness I hadn't experienced since Marcus's birth. They were beautiful, healthy babies, full of life. Tanya had a complicated delivery and needed a lot of help during the first weeks. I temporarily moved to their house to help with everything: cooking, cleaning, caring for the babies at night so Tanya could rest, washing the endless laundry that 2 newborns generate. It was exhausting for a woman my age, but I did it with love because it was my family. What began as a temporary 2-week stay extended to a month, then 2 months, then 6 months. Tanya always had some reason why she couldn't manage alone. The babies weren't sleeping well, she was too tired, Marcus worked long hours, and little by little, without realizing it, I became the resident domestic employee of the house. I was no longer the visiting grandmother who came to spoil the grandchildren. I was the person who got up at 3 in the morning when the babies cried, who washed diapers, who cooked for the whole family, who cleaned the house from top to bottom. But the most painful part wasn't the physical work. It was the way they gradually stopped treating me like family and began treating me like service stuff. Dinner table conversations no longer included me. Marcus and Tanya talked about their lives as if I wasn't there. When they had visitors, they introduced me as the grandmother who helps us instead of my mother. When they went out with friends on weekends, they simply informed me that I would stay home watching the children, without asking if I had plans or if I was too tired. It had become automatic. Tanya had a craving for the movies, Marcus wanted to watch the game with his friends, and Evelyn would stay home with the babies. Period. What hurt me most was that Marcus had stopped seeing me as his mother and saw me as a convenience. When the children were sick and needed extra care, I was the one who stayed awake all night. When there were doctor's appointments, I was the one who took them, because Tanya had things to do and Marcus had to work. When the children began to talk, their first words were Mama for Tanya, Dada for Marcus, and Nana for me. But when they needed something, food, diaper change, comfort, when they cried, they called for me, Nana, and I immediately ran to attend to them. During those 3 years, I slowly lost my own identity. I no longer had friends because I never had free time to cultivate friendships. I no longer had hobbies because all my time was dedicated to caring for the house and children. I no longer had my own life because my entire existence revolved around the needs of Marcus's family. And when I finally, after 3 years, decided I needed a few days for myself to help my sister Lorraine, I became a selfish and useless person who didn't understand the family's true priorities. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. What makes me happiest is having you here with me in these stories. Every like or subscribe makes me feel that we are growing together. Now, sitting in the darkness of Lorraine's guest room, I understood perfectly what had happened. Marcus hadn't become a bad person overnight. It had been a gradual process of getting used to me always being available, always willing to sacrifice my own needs for his, always ready to say yes to anything he asked of me. I had created this monster by teaching him that my time, my energy, my entire life were at his disposal without limits and without conditions. And now, at 72 years old, I was finally paying the price for having been too generous, too permissive, too willing to be the perfect martyr. But I also understood something more important. It wasn't too late to change things. If Marcus had learned to treat me like an employee, he could unlearn that lesson. If he had forgotten my value as a person and as a mother, he could remember it in the hardest way possible. And if he really believed I was useless, then it was time to show him exactly how much work a useless person did in his perfect life. The revenge wouldn't be explosive or dramatic. It would be silent, meticulous, and absolutely devastating. On my last day in Memphis, while Lorraine and I had breakfast quietly in her small kitchen, I told her everything I had been thinking during those 3 days. She listened in silence, nodding occasionally, and when I finished speaking, she took my hand and said, "Evelyn, honey, it was about time you woke up. That boy needs a lesson he'll never forget." She was right. Marcus had forgotten who I was and how much I had sacrificed for him. It was time to refresh his memory in the most effective way possible, by disappearing from his life and taking with me everything he had been taking for granted for years. The return flight to Atlanta was completely different from the one going to Memphis. I was no longer the same broken and humiliated woman who had left the capital 3 days before. During those 75 minutes in the air, as I watched the mountains of Tennessee disappear under the clouds, I mentally finalized every detail of the plan I had been forming in my head. It wouldn't be an explosive confrontation or a soap opera drama. It would be something much more effective and devastating: the silent disappearance of everything Marcus and Tanya had been taking for granted for years. When the plane landed at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, I knew exactly what I was going to do and how I was going to execute it. Marcus was waiting for me in the arrivals area with the twins, Malik and Miles. The children ran toward me shouting, "Nana! Nana!" and hugged me with that pure energy that only 3-year-old children have. For a moment, my heart softened seeing them, but I immediately remembered their father's cruel words and strengthened myself in my resolution. Marcus greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, but there was no apology in his eyes, no recognition of how terrible he had been to me before my trip. He simply said, "Mama, good that you're back. Tanya needs to go to the dentist tomorrow morning early, and we need you to watch the kids." He didn't even ask how my trip had been, how my sister Lorraine was doing, if I had rested well. He only informed me about my next responsibilities, as if I were an employee reporting back after vacation days. I smiled and nodded, but inside something hardened definitively. "Of course, son, no problem," I said with the same sweet voice as always. He had no idea those would be the last kind words he would hear from me for a long, long time. During the drive back to the house in East Point, the children excitedly told me everything that had happened while I was away. That Daddy had burned the eggs at breakfast, that Mommy didn't know where their clean pajamas were, that the house was very messy, according to Miles. Marcus drove in silence, but I could see in the rear-view mirror that each comment from the children made him more uncomfortable. It was obvious that the 3 days without me had been chaotic for them, but he would never admit it. His pride was too big to acknowledge that he needed the useless woman he had humiliated at the airport. When we arrived at the house, I immediately noticed the disorder: dirty dishes piled in the sink, clothes scattered throughout the living room, toys spread everywhere, the children's beds unmade. Tanya came out to greet me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Evelyn, so good you're back. It's been some very difficult days," she said, but her tone suggested more annoyance than genuine relief, as if my trip had been an irresponsible whim instead of a legitimate family necessity. I smiled and immediately began picking up the toys, but for the first time in years, every movement I made was part of a bigger plan. That first night back, after bathing the children, helping them with dinner, and putting them to bed with their favorite stories, I sat in my small bedroom and took out a notebook I had bought in Memphis. In that notebook, I began making a meticulous list of everything I did in that house, day after day. It wasn't just curiosity, it was documentation. I wanted to have an exact record of all my work, so that when the time came, Marcus and Tanya would understand perfectly what they were losing. The list was longer than I had imagined. Wake up at 5:30 in the morning to prepare breakfast for the whole family, pack the children's lunch boxes, wash, dry, and iron all the clothes, clean the house from top to bottom every day, do the grocery shopping, cook lunch and dinner, bathe the children, help them with their preschool homework, read them bedtime stories, get up in the early morning hours when they had nightmares, take them to the doctor when they got sick, organize their birthday parties, watch them when Tanya had social commitments. The list occupied 3 full pages of the notebook, and that was just what I remembered from memory. The next day, while Tanya went to the dentist and Marcus was at work, I began the first phase of my plan. I called the bank where I had my savings account and asked about all my financial assets. The information I received surprised even me. During all these years of living modestly and spending very little on myself, I had accumulated more money than I remembered. My government pension was substantial. I had savings from my time as a secretary, and there was also an account I had completely forgotten about, the money from Samuel's life insurance that I had never touched because I didn't need it. More importantly, I discovered something that Marcus had apparently completely forgotten. When I sold my property in East Point to help them buy the house, the lawyer had explained that for tax reasons, it was better to put the house in my name temporarily and then transfer it gradually to Marcus. But with all the chaos of the babies and daily responsibilities, that transfer had never been completed. Legally, I was the owner of 60% of the house where we lived. Marcus and Tanya believed it was theirs, but in reality, they were living in my property. That revelation changed my entire plan. It would no longer be simply a silent disappearance. It would be a complete lesson about the real value of things they had been taking for granted. I immediately called attorney Darnell Hughes, the lawyer who had handled the original purchase of the house, and scheduled an urgent appointment for the next day. When I explained my situation to him, he reviewed all the documents and confirmed what the bank had told me. "Mrs. Brooks, you have very clear legal rights over this property. If you want to make changes, you are completely within your rights to do so." During the following days, I maintained my normal routine completely. I got up early, prepared breakfasts, took care of the children, cleaned the house, cooked meals. But now every activity had a double purpose. Besides fulfilling my family responsibilities, I was meticulously documenting all my work for my future legal files. I discreetly took photos of the house clean after I finished my daily work. I saved all receipts from grocery shopping that I paid for with my money. I noted every hour I spent caring for the children when their parents went out. Marcus and Tanya didn't notice anything different in my behavior. They continued treating me exactly the same as before, like a convenient employee who existed to solve their domestic problems. Tanya continued going out with her friends on Saturday afternoons, automatically leaving me with the children. Marcus continued coming home from work and sitting down to watch television while I finished cleaning the kitchen after dinner. Neither of them thanked me even once during that week. Neither of them asked how I felt or if I needed anything. For them, I was part of the house furniture, useful, necessary, but invisible as a person. Friday morning, while Marcus was at work and Tanya had gone shopping with her friends, I took the children to my neighbor Hope's house and asked her to watch them for a few hours. "It's urgent, girl. I promise I'll be back before lunch," I told her. Hope, who had been a silent witness to how I was treated in that house for years, simply nodded and hugged Malik and Miles with affection. "Don't worry, Evelyn. They'll be perfectly fine here. You do what you have to do." I took a taxi downtown and spent the entire morning in Attorney Hughes's offices finalizing the documents that would change everything. I signed papers to transfer the house property completely to my name. I opened a new bank account where only I had access. I updated my will, removing Marcus as the primary beneficiary and leaving everything to a charity foundation for abandoned elderly people. When I left the law building at noon, I was no longer the same woman who had entered that morning. Legally, financially, and emotionally, I had already begun my new life. That afternoon, when Tanya returned from her shopping trip, loaded with bags of new clothes she had bought with the money Marcus earned, money that in turn depended on me watching the kids for free so she could work, she proudly showed me her purchases. "Look, Evelyn, I found this gorgeous blouse at Macy's. Isn't it divine?" She showed me a blouse that cost more than what I spent on clothes in 6 months. I smiled and congratulated her, but inside I was taking mental note of every dollar they spent on luxuries while expecting me to live like a selfless nun who needed nothing for herself. Saturday night, Marcus and Tanya went out to dinner with some friends to celebrate that Tanya had gotten a small raise at her part-time job. Of course, I stayed home watching the children, without anyone asking if I had plans or if I was tired. While I tucked them in and read them their favorite story about the 3 little pigs, I couldn't help but smile thinking about the irony. Marcus and Tanya believed they had built a solid brick house, but in reality, they had built their lives on a house of cards, and I was about to blow very, very hard. Sunday morning, after preparing a special breakfast with pancakes and fresh fruit, which would be the last breakfast I would prepare in that house, I sat at the table with Marcus and said in the calmest voice in the world, "Son, I need to talk to you about something important." He looked up from his cell phone with an annoyed expression, as if any conversation with me was an interruption to his relaxed Sunday. "What's wrong, Mama? Is it something urgent? Tanya and I were going to take the kids to the park after breakfast." I smiled and put my hands on the table. "Yes, Marcus, it's quite urgent. You see, I've been thinking a lot about what you told me at the airport about being useless." His expression changed immediately, and for the first time in weeks, I could see a shadow of guilt in his eyes. "Mama, He began to say something, but I raised my hand to silence him. "No, let me finish. You're right. I am useless to you. That's why I've decided to stop being a burden to this family." Tanya, who had been listening from the kitchen, approached the table with a confused expression. "What are you talking about, Evelyn?" I explained in a calm, clear voice that I had decided to move to my own apartment and give them the space they obviously needed. "But Mama," protested Marcus, "you don't need to move. You have your place here. You've always had your place." I smiled at the irony of his words. "My place, Marcus, apparently, is to be screamed at and called useless in airports full of people. I prefer to find a place where that doesn't happen." The color drained from his face when he understood that I remembered perfectly every cruel word he had said to me. And then I gave them the news that would change their lives forever. "By the way, since you're going to be alone in the house, you're going to need to take care of all the expenses, all the utility bills, property taxes, maintenance, everything, because starting tomorrow, I'm no longer going to contribute financially to this house." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus and Tanya looked at each other with growing panic as they began to process the implications of what I had just told them. For years, they had assumed that my pension and savings would always be available to supplement their family expenses. They had never stopped to calculate exactly how much money I contributed monthly to the household economy. But now they were about to find out in the hardest way possible. And that was just the beginning of the surprises I had prepared for them. The silence at the breakfast table lasted exactly 17 seconds before Tanya exploded. "You can't do that, Evelyn! How are we going to pay for everything alone? We don't even know how much all the bills cost each month." Her voice cracked a little at the end, and I could see genuine panic in her eyes. Marcus remained mute, his mouth slightly open as if he couldn't fully process what he had just heard. For years, he had taken for granted that I was an inexhaustible source of free labor and financial support, and he had never stopped to consider what would happen if that source suddenly dried up. "Well," I said, with a calm that surprised even me, "I suppose you're going to have to learn. I learned to manage all this alone when I was your age, after Samuel died. If I could do it being a widow with a small child, you can do it being two young adults with stable jobs." I got up from the table and began clearing the breakfast dishes, but Marcus stopped me by grabbing my arm. "Mama, wait. I don't understand why you're doing this. If it's about what happened at the airport, I already told you I'm sorry. I was stressed. I said things I didn't mean to say." It was the first time he had mentioned the airport incident since I had returned from Memphis, and the first time he had offered anything resembling an apology. But his words sounded hollow, as if he were following a script someone had taught him to handle difficult situations. I looked directly into his eyes and could see there was no real understanding there, no genuine comprehension of the damage he had caused me. There was only panic about the consequences he was facing. "Marcus," I said, gently removing my arm from his grip, "it's not just about what happened at the airport. It's about everything that's been happening for years. You've turned me into your personal domestic employee, and when I finally needed something for myself, you called me useless in front of hundreds of people. That taught me something very important, that I really am useless to you. That's why I've decided to stop being useless." Tanya got up abruptly from the table, knocking over her chair in the process. "This is ridiculous. You can't just leave and dump all the responsibilities on us. What are we going to do with the children? Who is going to watch them when I have to work? Who is going to take them to the doctor when they get sick?" The desperation in her voice was palpable, and I realized that for the first time in years, I was seeing the real Tanya, not the polite but distant daughter-in-law, but the woman who had been completely dependent on my unpaid labor to maintain her lifestyle. "Well," I responded with the same tranquility, "I suppose you're going to have to do what millions of working parents do all over America. Hire a babysitter, pay for daycare, or work it out between the two of you. There are many options available. But now you're going to have to pay for them with your own money, instead of taking for granted that Grandma Evelyn will always be available for free." The next 30 minutes were a whirlwind of pleas, threats, tears, and emotional manipulation. Marcus tried to use the children as leverage. But what will Malik and Miles think when they know their grandmother abandoned them? Tanya attempted religious guilt. What will people at church say when they know you left your family? They even tried financial bribery. "We can pay you a salary if you want, Mama. How much do you need? $2,000 a month? $3,000? The salary offer almost made me laugh out loud. After years of 24-hour free labor, they were now offering me less than what a part-time housekeeper would earn. It was the final confirmation that they had never truly valued my contribution to their lives. For them, all my work, all my dedication, all my personal sacrifice was worth less than $100 a day. That realization gave me the final strength I needed to move forward with my plan. "No," I said firmly, "it's not a matter of money. It's a matter of respect and dignity, things that can't be bought." I went up to my bedroom and began packing my belongings in the 2 suitcases I had prepared. I didn't have many things. After years of living for others, I had accumulated very few personal possessions, but the few things that were truly mine, I packed with care. The photos of Samuel and me in our early years of marriage, the love letters he had written to me, some books I had bought but never had time to read, and my pearl rosary that I had inherited from my grandmother. While I packed, I could hear Marcus and Tanya talking in low, urgent voices in the living room. Occasionally, I caught fragments of their conversation. "She can't be serious. We'll have to cancel the gym membership. How much does daycare cost?" It was painfully obvious they were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were losing, but they still didn't fully comprehend the financial implications of my departure. When I came downstairs with my suitcases an hour later, I found the whole family gathered in the living room. The children were confused and scared, clearly feeling the tension in the air but not understanding what was happening. Malik, the more expressive of the twins, ran toward me and hugged my legs. "Where are you going, Nana? Why do you have suitcases?" His innocent question broke my heart, but I remained firm. I knelt down to be at his level and explained in words he could understand. "Nana is going to live in her own little house for a while, my love, but I'm going to keep loving you very much, always." Miles approached too, and I hugged them both, feeling tears threaten to flow from my eyes. These children weren't to blame for their parents' mistakes, but unfortunately, they would have to learn along with Marcus and Tanya what it meant to value the important people in their lives. "Mama, please, reconsider," Marcus begged me once more. "We can talk about this. We can make changes. You don't have to leave." But his tone was still the same he would use to convince a valuable employee not to quit. Calculated, worried about practical consequences, but without real emotional understanding of the damage he had caused. "Marcus," I said while taking my suitcases, "for 3 years, I've been available to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I've sacrificed my own life, my own peace, my own dignity to make your lives easier. And when I finally needed 3 days to help my sick sister, you called me useless in front of hundreds of strangers. That was your response to a lifetime of dedication. There's nothing to reconsider." I called a taxi from my cell phone, and in 10 minutes it was waiting outside the house. During those 10 minutes, Marcus and Tanya tried different last-minute strategies to make me change my mind. Tanya cried and promised to treat me better. Marcus talked about family therapy and improved communication. They even mentioned the possibility of giving me more space and more personal time, but all their offers sounded like business negotiations, not genuine recognition that they had treated me badly for years. When the taxi arrived, I took my suitcases and walked toward the door. The children ran behind me, crying and asking when I was going to return. That was the hardest part of the whole process, but I knew it was necessary. If I wanted to teach Marcus and Tanya a lesson they would remember forever, I had to be willing to pay the emotional price that required. "I'll give you my new address," I told them before getting into the taxi. "You can visit the children whenever you want, but only after you learn to treat me with respect." Marcus tried to ask where I was going to live, but I simply closed the taxi door and gave the driver the address of my new apartment in Old Fourth Ward. During the trip to my new life, I allowed myself to cry for the first time in weeks. They weren't tears of regret, but of relief and sadness mixed together. Relief because I had finally had the courage to defend myself. Sadness because it had taken me so many years to find that courage, and because the relationship with my son would possibly never be the same again. But there was also a strange sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in decades. For the first time in years, I didn't have to worry about anyone's needs but my own. The apartment I had rented in Old Fourth Ward was small but bright, with large windows facing a tree-lined street. It had one bedroom, a small living room, a functional kitchen, and most importantly, it was completely mine. No one was going to yell at me there, no one was going to give me orders, no one was going to take for granted that I existed solely to solve their problems. While I unpacked my few belongings, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. That first night in my new home, I prepared a simple dinner just for myself: grilled chicken with collard greens and a cup of chamomile tea. And I ate it in silence while watching the news. It was strange not having to get up every 5 minutes to serve more food, clean spills, or mediate fights between children. It was strange not hearing the television at full volume in the living room while Marcus watched sports, or the constant noise of Tanya talking on the phone with her friends. It was strange, but also wonderfully peaceful. Around 9 at night, my phone began to ring. It was Marcus, of course. During the next 2 hours, he called me 17 times. The first messages were pleading, "Mama, please answer, we need to talk." The next ones were panic. "The kids won't go to sleep without their bedtime story. Can you come just to tuck them in?" The last ones were desperation. "Mama, Tanya is crying. We don't know what to do. Please come home." But I didn't answer any calls, not because I wanted to punish them, but because I needed them to understand that the consequences of treating people badly are real and lasting. For years, they had been able to treat me however they wanted, because they knew I would always come back, always forgive, always be available. It was time for them to learn that unconditional love doesn't mean infinite tolerance for mistreatment. By the end of that first week in my new life, I had established a simple but satisfying routine. I woke up when I wanted to, had breakfast without rushing, went for walks in Piedmont Park, read the books I had bought years ago but never had time to enjoy. In the afternoons, I visited small coffee shops, talked with other ladies my age, or simply sat on a bench to watch life go by. It was a simple existence, but infinitely richer than the life of constant service I had been living. Messages and calls from Marcus and Tanya continued throughout that week, but gradually the tone changed from pleas to real panic. "Mama, the kids got sick and we don't know what to do. Mama, we got an electricity bill for $300 and we didn't know it cost so much. Mama, Tanya had to miss work because we don't have anyone to watch the children." Each message confirmed what I already knew. They had built their entire lives around my unpaid work, and now that that foundation had disappeared, their whole world was crumbling. But there was one more lesson they had to learn, and I was waiting for the perfect moment to teach it to them, because they still didn't know the most devastating truth of all: that the house where they lived, the house they considered theirs, actually belonged legally to me, and I was about to show them exactly how much power a useless woman had when she finally decided to use it. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Now, I'm curious, after this story, which words stayed with you the most? Write them in the comments. Let's see which ones touch the most hearts.